Hi everyone, this is Shannon Williams from Rancher Labs. I'm sorry we've had so many problems this morning with our audio. I hope everyone can hear me now. If you can hear me, please let me know. Send me a question or a chat and I'll know that at least everything is working correctly. But hopefully we've got it all going. Will, are you there?
We're here. Can you hear us?
I can hear you just fine. Okay.
Okay.
Well, at least we've got it up and working now. I really apologize, everyone. For some reason, there was just an issue with GoToWebinar this morning, and we couldn't get the audio going for a minute. But we're up and running now. So welcome, everyone, to our October 2018 online meetup, migrating from Rancher 1.6 to Rancher 2.1. And we've got a great meetup scheduled for you today. I'm Shannon Williams. I'm one of the founders here at Rancher. As usual, I'm joined by some of my colleagues. Darren isn't here today, but I have two amazing people on the phone with me. Will Chan, my co-founder and our VP of Engineering. Will, how are you?
Very good.
Awesome, fantastic. And Prachi, who is one of our senior software engineers and really led all the work on the team that is working around tooling for migrating from 1.6 to 2.1. Hi, Prachi.
Hi Shannon, welcome everyone.
Okay, so as always, we have an enormous group of people online for today's meetup. We are also recording it. And, I always try to start us off with just a reminder that this is a meetup. It's your meetup. It is not a webinar. It is a discussion forum that is open-ended. We go as long as need be to hit all of the topics. We also really encourage questions. So, unlike a typical webinar, we won't ask you to kind of hold all your questions to the end. If you've got questions and we think they're relevant to the discussion, we will kind of slow things down in the middle, maybe ask Prachi or Will to dive into something in a little bit more depth. There really aren't any bad questions, so fire away, whatever you're interested in. Obviously, this is a big topic for a lot of people today. We're going to be getting into, there's more than 15,000 teams running Rancher 1.6, and I know for a lot of you, it's the backbone of lots of really important systems. So, understanding where, what needs to be done if you want to move to 2.0 or move to Kubernetes, we're going to be covering all those things today. As usual, we are going to be doing a lot of demos and showing you this stuff as opposed to just talking about it. That said, today will be a little more slide heavy than usual because there's a lot of very specific concepts we want to outline. Because this is live, there's no recordings, things break. As always, be patient. Big reminder that we really won't be done on time. There's no kind of hard stop on this. We start and very often go for 2 hours for these meetups. So if you need to leave, don't stress. The meetup is being recorded. You can go to youtube.com/channel/rancher and find every recording we've done in the past. So if you need to leave, don't worry. We're even trying to post the questions now. I think our team has figured out a way to kind of post the questions up on GitHub, so you can find them there if you want to see some of the questions that were asked and answered during the discussion. But between that and hopefully giving you a Slack channel at the end of this that you can go to ask questions directly to our engineers and other people that are going through the migration. Don't worry if you need to cut out for a bit. There'll be a lot of ways to get this information. I'll also be posting all these slides to SlideShare, so you can find the slides that we've covered today. So this is an amazing meetup community. A lot of you are sort of regular attendees. And as you know, when you register for Meetup, you kind of have the option to automatically get registered again and again. So we end up with thousands and thousands of people who are registered, and usually hundreds, if not thousands of people on these meetups every month, and more than 1,000 views of them after they go live. So it's a big community of people out there. If you're new to us, please post a picture on Twitter, throw a hashtag Rancher Meetup on there, and we'll welcome you to the group. We are all trying to do a lot of the same things. So welcome one another, maybe make some friends. We have a Slack channels on the Rancher user Slack. If you're not already a member of that, I would highly recommend joining that. And if you do have questions during the sessions today, please use the questions bar. over in GoToWebinar. It's a place we kind of track questions as they come in. Okay, so for our agenda, I will be kicking us off as usual, just with a really short kind of 2-slide "Who is Rancher" thing for anyone who's new to Rancher. I don't think we'll have a lot of those today, since it is very much focused on a deep problem like migration. Then Will's going to dive into a high-level discussion about what's changed between 1.0 and 2.0. We've been talking about this now since last year this time, when we first introduced 2.0 as the next release of Rancher and where it was going. We introduced, we talked a lot about kind of how things would be changing between, especially for users of cattle as we move to a Kubernetes-based platform. The release of 2.0 was back in April, so since then we've been talking about 2.0 a lot. So hopefully you're all kind of up to speed on where 2.0 is, but we are going to spend some time on that. Then the majority of the session will be Prachi. We'll be talking about some of the things that are different between cattle and Kubernetes, especially. We'll go into some of the mechanisms that are needed to understand in order to implement an application using some of the things you think of as kind of traditionally cattle, like a metadata service, and how you find the equivalent mechanisms in Kubernetes that work there. We'll then kind of talk about sort of migrating applications. This whole focus is on how to take your existing deployments and recreate them so they run really well on Kubernetes. So the demo Prachi will give is very specifically looking at a cattle compose deployment and how to move that to Kubernetes YAML. We'll then show you all the different type of migration artifacts you need to deal with and everything else that might come up as challenges. We'll introduce you to kind of the Slack channel and the likes, and then we're not going anywhere. So feel free to write down your questions. If you do ask a question and I don't respond to it, it's not because we're just ignoring it. It's because I actually want to keep that question for a little bit later in the discussion, because we're either going to be touching on it or something else. And if I respond directly to you, I kind of lose the question, so I can't see it. So don't worry if I don't respond to your question right away. We'll be getting to it in a minute. Okay, with that, I just wanted to kind of let everyone know who's new here for any reason they don't know what Rancher is. Rancher is a software company. We are about 100 people. We've grown a lot since we ran our first online meetup like this 2 years ago. The company builds open source products. Our most famous open source product is Rancher itself. Rancher is an open source container management platform. The first version of Rancher released in the spring of 2016, so it's now about 2.5 years old. 2.0 that released earlier this year, it was a major change, as we'll be talking about earlier in a couple weeks, but in a couple minutes. But basically, the idea behind Rancher 2.0 is to provide an enterprise platform for running Kubernetes everywhere. And what it does, it brings together the DevOps teams that use containers and build their applications in them with the IT organization, who kind of sets policy for how infrastructure gets consumed, connects it up to all of the RBAC and identity management systems, defines security policies, and allows those teams to collaborate to build, Kubernetes clusters centrally, manage how they're consumed, run them on any infrastructure. And that idea is really at the core of Rancher. Provide a lot of tooling that makes the lives of the DevOps teams easier to actually use containers in Kubernetes, and provide the IT infrastructure so that people can deliver it. When you think about Rancher, it's really sort of 3 layers of technology. We have our own Kubernetes distribution we call RKE, that's open source, that anyone can use. It's a deployment tool for building Kubernetes clusters. But we also allow you to import either existing clusters or launch clusters in the cloud that we create, or create clusters from hosted Kubernetes services like Google and Azure. So with Rancher, you can really build out almost like a cloud of Kubernetes clusters, where Kubernetes itself is potentially a different service in different places, but managed centrally. So once you've created all these clusters in Rancher, you have the ability then to manage their lifecycle and manage how they're consumed. So there's a whole set of functionality that's really geared for the IT team called Unified Cluster Management. It's where we deal with security policies and identification and sort of managing the provisioning and upgrade of the clusters. It's where we deal with auth and capacity management, all those types of things that you care about if you're thinking about cluster density, or you're thinking about overall cluster health and the likes, where there's centralized logging and monitoring sort of for cluster level stuff. Then there's a whole level of workload management that's geared around the users of these actual services. So within a cluster, you can create projects, which are groups of namespaces. You have visibility into what you're creating. You can have dedicated Helm charts and catalogs that you can manage. There's fully integrated alerting and logging and monitoring and CI/CD and a lot of the tooling people need around containers. Or you can just use the stuff you already have. So it's really geared around sort of giving the DevOps teams a lot of flexibility, where they get all the capabilities they would have of a dedicated cluster, but maybe they're only getting a shared component within a cluster. Or you can actually delegate the full administration of a cluster out to a team. So multi-cluster management for organizations that are really building around containers as how they're going to deploy their applications into different infrastructure stacks is the idea behind Rancher. So with that, I want to turn the discussion today over to Will Chan. We're going to be talking about this idea of how to migrate from 1.6 to 2.1, and we're going to be covering a lot of content. So Will, do you have your slides up and running?
Yeah, can you pass it to Prachi? I'm an expert, so just pass
perfect.
one.
So you guys should have control. You should be able to share your screen now.
Can you see my screen, Shannon?
I certainly can.
All right.
And now it's full screen.
Okay.
Right. So yep, there's a lot of text here, but before I get to kind of the differences between 1x and 2x, I do want to do some high level about what's happened this year. So you guys already know we did introduce 2.0 on May 1st, 2018. We just recently shipped 2.1 October 5th. Of this month. Just a high level for those that are interested, I will give you a kind of a quick feature overview about 2.1. It's not exhaustive, but I picked some of the high level ones. So I'll just quickly go through that. With 2.1, we're supporting project quota. We already have the concept projects today in 2.0, but we added the ability to set quota now, and that'll also apply to your namespaces. We added the join coordinate features for the nodes. This is something that always exists in Kubernetes, but we've extended, we made it available through our user interface as well, and made it a bit easier to use. Our pipeline feature that we introduced in 2.0, we've made general UX improvements, but we also added GitLab. I think even the next iteration, you'll see a big Bitbucket. But most importantly, we've added the CD part of it. With 2.0, we only had up to CI. Up until the point where you can essentially create your Docker image, but we had no way to deploy it, and so now we include the full deployment aspect of the pipeline. So take a look at that if you have a chance. We made a lot of improvements to scale, performance, HA. Those have been made throughout from between 2.0 and 2.1, so hopefully you should see improvements on that, and there's more to come in 2.2 as well. We add a lot of new auth providers, Keycloak, ADFS, Ping, OpenL.free IPA, and again, we're going to be adding more. OpenID is actually something that we're looking into as well. But again, if you have any suggestions of what additional auth providers you'd like to see, feel free to Slack, forums, GitHub issues. We'll take a look. EKS also had, they had a 2.0 support essentially end of August. With 2.1, we fixed it to support it now, so that's actually in it as well. 1.12, you guys know, was recently shipped, so we added that. It's actually an experimental when we shipped 2.1, but I think in a 2.1x patch, very close, we'll make that full support for it. So we just wanted to make sure that the 1.12 is stable enough. Usually when Kubernetes ships something, the .0s, they usually have a .1 or .2 immediately after that to address issues. So we're just waiting for that before we make it fully supported for Rancher. Experimental Windows, you should see that. So you'll be able to create Kubernetes cluster and have Windows support as well. So it's an experimental right now. So for those of you that do use Windows, again, take a look at that. Welcome to feedback. And then, of course, the most important thing, which you'll see as part of today's meetup, is all about the blogs, documentation, guides, how-to video. We create a lot of that really just shows and takes a compose file and explains how you can get from that to a Kubernetes YAML file. So that's a lot of work was put into that as part of the 2.1 feature release. So that's it for 2.1. The other thing I want to kind of explain is our end of life. We've in the past and in these things we've been talking about it as well, is just when do we end support for this? So well, we went with the 2.1 shipment and all the the guides. We hopefully this should give you enough or give you guys the ability to fully migrate. And again, we're going to have Slack channels dedicated to doing this. So during your process, if you guys have problems, we'll be more than happy to help you. So with that, we're gonna end our end of support. And again, this is actually if you guys are customers of Rancher or you paid a subscription license to us. But even from the open source community, we plan to end our maintenance releases by end of 2019, so December 31st. It's another year and 3 months out for you guys to move to migrate. But during that time, you're going to continue to see 1.6, 25, 26, 27 as we see bugs and et cetera. We'll continue to ship that throughout all of next year. But it will stop end of 2019. After that, we have our usual limited support period before it truly ends of life, 6 months after that. And during that time, we won't be shipping regular patches except to address any security issues, CVE that we find. And then finally, June 30th, we plan to end of life the 1.6 platform. So hopefully this gives you a full year, almost a year and 9 months for you to move into the 2.0 platform. All right, so I wanted to give you guys, and this is not fully exhaustive, but I wanted to tell you guys kind of the major differences at a high level between 1.6 and 2.1. And some of these are pretty obvious. And Prachi is going to go through a lot of these in much more detail when she goes through her demo of how we move that compose to YAML file. So she'll explain to you kind of how it is in cattle and then what it can be in Kubernetes, and then gives you kind of pros and cons to some of these things of why you would choose these new concepts in Kubernetes to apply these concepts to. So I'll just go through down the list. From an orchestration engine standpoint, obviously, and I'm only really talking about cattle. I know 1.6 we support Kubernetes as well, but for this meetup, it's specifically the cattle orchestration engine versus the Kubernetes orchestration in 2.1. So obviously the orchestration is different. YAML file in 1.0 we had our Rancher plus Docker compose format. In Kubernetes is obviously Kubernetes YAML format. In terms of catalog support, again, it's the Rancher Docker compose format. In 2.1, it's actually leveraging Helm. For the storage system we use, it's MySQL. In 2.1, it's etcd because we have written 2.1 on top of a Kubernetes cluster, so it's using etcd. So there's fundamental difference between that as well. From a development platform standpoint, we've written 1.6 in the combination of Java and Golang. 2.1 is exclusively Golang now. Networking in 1.6, we had IPsec, we had VXLAN. We actually had some host subnet as well. But in 2.1, it's Flannel, Canal. You can also optionally use Calico and Weave, but it's not something that is something that was uniquely developed by Rancher. Now we're actually using what's open source out there today. For storage framework, we had our own custom storage framework. It was loosely based off of the whole persistent volume Kubernetes as well. But 2.1, obviously, it's leveraging the Kubernetes persistent volume storage class for storage. Metadata, this one's a little bit, this is actually a pretty big impact for those that are using the Rancher metadata to pull based on changes on your services. In Kubernetes, there's no such thing anymore. So an alternative way to do it is what you do. You have to subscribe to these Kubernetes events for the Kubernetes construct or resources in order to determine what you do next. So it's a little bit different, push-based now. API, we have Rancher v1, v2 in 1.6, and 2.1 is v3. It's completely different. I don't think there's any similarities between the two, simply because it's now Kubernetes-based. And of course, you can always access 2.1 via native Kubernetes API, so you can also do that as well. Everything in 2.1 is written as CRDs, so we have both the Rancher kind of a REST-based API that you can use, or you can just use it directly from Kubernetes as well. From a CLI standpoint, in 1.6 we had Rancher and Rancher Compose. In 2.1 we have Rancher, and of course you use kube control, kubectl to manage your clusters and workloads. Load balancers, it was exclusively H8 proxy in 1.6, and 2.1 it is the Nginx Ingress. However, they do have options for things like traffic and H8 proxy as well. But the one that ships out of the box with 2.1 is the Nginx Ingress controller. And then just from an application standpoint, kind of these are really just constructs. Or in 1.6 we had the notion of stack services container. In 2.1 you get the notion of namespace or workloads. These are like replica set, stateful set. Again, Prachi will go in more details, and then the concept of pods, which is a little bit different in 2.1 as well. So what does this all mean? I mean, there's no way to put it so bluntly. There's just no way for a direct upgrade, and we investigated throughout that period. Just the technology is so vastly different that you couldn't take a 1.6 and just apply 2 on top of it and have it work. And so that's why we call it, this is a migration effort, because what you have to do, install 2.1 and then start migrating your workloads from 1.6 cattle to the 2.1 platform. And so kind of high level what you would do. So there's a couple of things you're going to have to do. The first thing is, of course, re-enabling the authentication scheme. If you were using AD, for example, on 1.6, you would have to reconfigure that in 2.1. The workflow is actually pretty identical. We kept that the same, so this shouldn't take very long for you to do. So that's number one. The second big thing is to recreate your environment. In 1.6, you had the notion of an environment, which really was your scope of nodes and the resources that you deploy on that. And in 2.1, we've broken that down into the concept of a cluster, which is really akin to a Kubernetes cluster. And then our kind of unique thing we added, which was the concept of projects. And so you're going to have to recreate those, re-invite your users, assign the correct roles to it. Of course, with 2.1, you get the whole RBAC solution, so it's a lot better than 1.6, which had static roles. In 2.1, you get to custom create the roles and permissions, and then assign them individually at a cluster and project level. And so there is some unique more value add on top of the 2.1 platform. And then I think the last thing I want to make a call out is if you guys were using an older version of Docker as well, you might have to update. This is an optional thing. I'm not sure. Depending on what Docker version you guys are using today, you may have to do a little upgrade there in order to support whatever Kubernetes is required. I know Kubernetes supports some pretty old ones, but we're moving on towards 17.03, et cetera, and above. And then the last thing, the big one, which is what the meetup is about, is about migrating your 1.6 to 2.1, and that's really what this meetup is about. Throughout this thing, we know it's a pretty tough challenge. We did it through ourselves. We had to eat our own dog food, so to speak. So Prachi spent a lot of time, going through the whole process of taking a Docker Compose file that we support, and then moving it to 2.1. And I don't know if we've caught them all. And so I'm sure we're gonna miss some throughout this meetup, but we did want to go through at least the major pieces that we found during this process, and kind of teach you guys how you guys can do it yourself. But again, we're gonna have a Slack, forums, GitHub issues for you guys to find. So if you guys go through this process and find some we didn't address, please let us know. Again, I went through all the blogs and things, so we'll go through that. And then with that, what you're gonna see, we also created a video. So not only can you go through this live meetup to see how Prachi did it, we have videos as well. And so hopefully everything that we want to do here will be enough for you to do. And one of the things we did consider, it was just simply doing a tool to do this. But during this process, we realized the biggest problem is not about the tool, because no one's going to, we don't expect you guys to continue to do Compose forever and then use a tool to convert it to Kubernetes YAML file. I think the biggest problem for us, and actually for you guys, and what we've heard, is really just the education part of it, which is why we spent the bulk of our time documenting and creating videos to address it. So with that, let's just get started. I'll pass it on to Prachi.
Hey, well, before you get started, there were one or two questions that I did want to kind of bring up. And I think you're going to probably get this, but one that was very kind of beginning-centric was, what are the Docker-supported releases for, I assume that question means for 2.1 or in terms of where you're, but maybe you can just ask about, repeat that again.
Yeah, so it's actually in our website as well, but I think 17.03 is our minimum now going forward. And the way Kubernetes actually only tests, I'm not even sure what they test on, maybe in the older version, but they do a test against Containerd, and that's where 17.03, et cetera, are based off of. So we're going to try to keep it as modern as possible right now. And it depends on which OS you're using. I think if you're using upstream Docker, it's going to be 17.03. Of course, if you're using something like RHEL, they have their own supported Docker. I don't know if it's 17.03 yet, it may be 1.13. that will support. But certainly if you're in upstream, it's going to be 1703. That's the minimum now.
Awesome. There are a couple other things that maybe as we're going, people are already asking questions about, and I think we're going to cover some of them, and some of them we may want to cover back later. But I just want to bubble them up. I think one question or one comment that came up earlier, which I thought was really pertinent. Someone said, hey, I've got like a 2-node Rancher server running in production today, and I'm a little bit skeptical about taking on all of Kubernetes for such a small deployment. Is there anything? I'm hoping today you're going to convince me, but but I'm a bit cautious that I really need all of this for something that's really small. So it's something to think about as we're talking, just as we're going, where does some of the overhead of Kubernetes that people, do need to understand when they're making that kind of a change from that type of application. Another good one that came in, someone asked was, my main concern, Alessandro said, my main concern about migration are the persistent volumes. Rancher NFS is pretty good, and I don't really get how persistent volumes can be used in Kubernetes. So another kind of concept, I don't know how much we're going to talk about persistent volumes today, but it's definitely one that people are kind of interested in and trying to ask questions on. One more was about Terraform. Both Robert and Nick asked in the last couple minutes, said for Rancher 1.6, there's a Terraform provider. Is there a provider for 2.1? And then Nick said, is Terraform support for Rancher 2.0 still scheduled for the 2.2 milestone? So I thought maybe you could kind of just some things to answer or keep in mind while we get started.
Yeah, let me answer it before I forget. So in case of it, let me answer all of them. So let me go work backwards because that's what I remember. So Terraform, yes, I think we are going to be writing Terraform scripts for 2.2 as well. I don't know if it's out there yet, but I know it's something we're working on. So that should be there. That is actually a work in progress if it's not there already. But I can also check on that where the status is at. But definitely we're going to do a Terraform version of Rancher as well. The second question, or at least the first one I remember, is I'm skeptical about moving to 2-node. So with yes, there is additional resource requirements for these Kubernetes clusters, no doubt about it. I think if you want to deploy in what we say in a traditional production grade Kubernetes cluster, you typically what we recommend is 3 nodes for etcd, of course, to maintain quorum for that, and then 2 additional nodes for what we call the control plane, which is for example, it contains the Kubernetes API manager. For HA, full HA, in case one goes down, you still have access to your Kubernetes cluster. But that's full production. You're welcome to do it in any combination. The minimum is obviously just one of each. You can also have just one one etcd, one for control plane. You can put all on the same node if you want to. So if we won't be able to cover it here, but when you create 2.0 and you create a Kubernetes cluster, it gives you the option to deploy these even at a single node if you wish to do it. It just really depends on how much high availability you want for those cluster itself. So we're going to give you some flexibility, but you are correct. There is going to be a little bit of resource cost because it is Kubernetes right now. And then the second question, persistent volumes. So I don't think we're going to be able to address that in this because it's just a lot. That itself is probably its own topic. So we're actually working on that now. We're working on a blog that will release fairly soon. So expect to see that. We're going to take the exact the one that someone mentioned in the questions, which is we're actually going to take the Rancher NFS. The way we do persistent volume NFS and then convert it into the equivalent NFS, PV and Kubernetes as well, and teach you guys how you can do that and how we can migrate from that over. So that one actually, we won't be able to cover that because I do agree it's a bit more complicated. And so that we're going to address in the blog, and if we have to do another meetup to cover through that, we can certainly do that at a later time.
Okay, so loads more questions. I mean, I think opening it up to questions right there was probably not my best choice ever. So why don't we just dive in? Let Prachi get into her content. Will, there's just tons of questions. You may want to just answer some of these as
I'll answer it. I'll answer it and try to answer it. Yep.
Okay, great. All right, Prachi, and please reply to all so everyone can see the answers, unless someone specifically says they want to answer it privately. So I know a lot of people watch the questions as they're kind of flying through and comment. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Prachi.
All right, welcome everyone. We'll move on to the next part of the meetup. So what we are going to go over today is how to move workloads to V2.1 Now, first we will go over some Kubernetes concepts because we need to know about some Kubernetes terminologies that are different from Rancher 1.6 version. And then we'll go over a migration checklist, which lists some bullet points that you need to consider when you're migrating your 1.6 setups to 2.1. And then we will dive into demoing my 1.6 application, a sample 1.6 application being migrated to v2.1. I'll be taking the Docker Compose config files of this application and showcasing how they can be converted to Kubernetes YAML. And while we are showcasing this, we will be switching back and forth between the slides and the demo as we proceed. So starting with some Rancher 2.x terminologies that we need to know about. So Kubernetes has brought in a lot of new terminologies which are very different than Rancher 1.6. To start with, we have something called as a cluster. So a Kubernetes cluster is nothing but a collection of your host machines on which you will be deploying your containerized application workloads. And these applications will be managed by Kubernetes. We have something called as namespace. A Kubernetes namespace is nothing but a grouping boundary provided by Kubernetes, which groups your application workloads. A cluster can have multiple namespaces. While I'm at this, I also want to talk about project. Project is a term that Rancher 2.x has introduced. So this is another grouping boundary, and project is a group of namespaces, and users can be assigned to various projects under Rancher 2.x. Next is the node, which is nothing but the host of Rancher 1.6. Then we have pod. Pod is the smallest and simplest Kubernetes object, the basic building block. If you're coming from the Docker background of Rancher 1.6, container was the basic building block for 1.6. For Kubernetes, it is the pod. Pod represents a set of running containers. It can be one or more containers on your cluster. And each pod is assigned an IP address by Kubernetes. Then we have various objects in Kubernetes, and some of them are deployment. Deployment is an API object which defines the set of rules in which your pods are deployed. So any load balancing rules, any scheduling rules, any health check mechanisms that you want to apply to your pod, you specify them in the deployment specs. There are other kind of objects like daemon set, which is nothing but global service of Rancher 1.6. Then we have a stateful set for the stateful applications. Then for periodic jobs, we have something in Kubernetes called as jobs or cron job. Lastly, I want to talk about workload. Workload is nothing but units of work which are running on your cluster. So anything like a group of pods or these Kubernetes objects like daemon sets or deployments, all of them come under the term workload. Under Rancher 2.x, when we are deploying applications, you will see that the UI uses the term workload. So in 1.6, you were deploying services. In 2.x, it gets replaced by the term workload. With this is a simple chart of which shows you the terminology parallels between the two versions. So we just talked about a few of them. So quickly briefing to that, container is similar to that is the pod. For Rancher 1.6 services, we have workload. The load balancer of Rancher 1.6 gets mapped to typical uses of HTTP, HTTPS load balancing gets mapped to the Kubernetes ingress. In 1.6, the users used to group their services under stacks. For that, in 2.0, you can group your workloads under namespaces, which is also the Kubernetes native entity. Now, in Rancher 1.6, once you set up a 1.6 platform, you used to get a default environment. So anything that you are deploying used to be deployed in a particular environment. Analogous to that, in Rancher 2.0 is the project and a cluster. So the Kubernetes cluster is what you have to first set up once you have set up Rancher 2.0. To that Kubernetes cluster, you assign your compute nodes on which your application workloads will get deployed. And then further, Rancher allows you to create projects to which you can assign users as members and assign RBAC rules to the users to access the resources. So in 2.0, the compute gets assigned to the cluster, but the administration responsibility is assigned at the project level. So together, a cluster and a project maps to the Rancher 1.6 environment. Now, actually, this is beneficial because using projects in Rancher 2.0, users can implement multi-tenancy. The other two terms that I have just jotted down is Rancher 1.6 host is nothing but a node in 2.0, and the catalog in which all our templates of Docker Compose and Rancher Compose files are stored and you can launch applications from. Helm is the analogous term for that in Rancher 2.0, where Helm charts are stored. So moving on, just a quick migration checklist. So in order to move your 1.6 setups to 2.0, you will have to install Rancher 2.0. There are installation documentation provided on Rancher documentation website. Next thing to do is you have to make sure that you use the supported version of Docker. On your installed Rancher, next thing to do is you configure authentication. Now, as Bill had touched upon, we have all the authentication providers supported by 1.6 still supported by 2.0, and we have new ones also added. One important thing new in 2.0 is local auth is always on. So even if you have enabled authentication using some provider, you will always have local auth, which is on underlying. Then the next thing is setting up your environment. That is setting up your cluster, assigning compute nodes to it, and setting up your projects. Then for the Rancher 1.6 setup, if you have multiple user stacks in which your applications are running, you would go ahead and create equivalent namespaces in your Rancher 2.0 setup. And once that is done, you would have to start just migrating your apps. In Rancher 1.6, typically, if you're using the cattle environment, the way you would start doing this is get the Docker Compose files and convert them to Kubernetes YAML, and then launch the Kubernetes workloads using that. If you already had Kubernetes environment in Rancher 1.6, then you can just import those YAML files directly onto Rancher 2.0. So now we will start with a sample 1.6 application. What I'm going to do is show the exported compose configs from my 1.6 stack. Then I already have a Rancher 2.1 setup with a cluster and a project, and we can go over the namespace creation in there. Then once you have the compose configs from your 1.6 stacks, we have a migration tool which we have created to help the migration task. So what this tool does is we will give the Docker Compose and Rancher Compose as input to the tool, and this tool provides a list of constructs that you have to take care of and convert to Kubernetes YAML specs. And then these YAML specs can be deployed to your Rancher 2.1 setup using either the CLI or if you're using the Rancher 2.2 UI, you can directly import the Kubernetes YAML from the UI. So here is my 1.6 application compose config file. I'll quickly go over what services I will be covering today. So I have a Let's Chat application here. So the web service is running the image Let's Chat, and it has exposed the port. It's a private container port 8080 onto the public host port 9890. Also, if you can see the label section, the Let's Chat, this particular service is using IO Rancher scheduler global label, which means that in Rancher 1.6, this label tells Rancher to deploy this service as a global service. Now, along with this web service, this Let's Chat image is dependent on finding the Mongo container. So I have another service called as a database service here, which is running the Mongo image. And if you check the label section of it, it is basically using a host label affinity rule, a soft affinity rule. Now, the third is my LB service, which is fronting my web service. Um, Moving on to the Rancher Compose part of this config file. For my web service, I have configured a health check, which is a TCP health check, which opens a TCP connection on port 8080 periodically. And my LB config is present in the Rancher Compose. This is because the load balancer feature is provided by Rancher using its HA proxy container. So the LB config has the port rule, which is using a host name and path-based routing rule. With this, we will move on to actually see how I have set up my Rancher 2.1. So this is a Rancher 2.1 setup I have. Once I have set up my 2.1, it takes me to this global view under which I can add my Kubernetes cluster. There are multiple ways of adding your Kubernetes cluster using a hosted Kubernetes provider or using nodes from infrastructure provider. Right now, I have a cluster using the DigitalOcean nodes. So I'll drill down to the cluster, and under the cluster, you can see that there is the projects which are listed. A default project is already provided by Rancher. Under the project, you can create namespaces. Now I have created a namespace my app because my 1.6 setup had the stack named my app. I will be then converting my config files to Kubernetes YAML and deploying to my namespace my app. One way of deploying that is on the Rancher 2.0 UI, you have the import YAML option where you can directly import your Kubernetes YAML file and deploy the application to the namespace of your choice. Other way is to download the Rancher CLI and configure the CLI to use with this 2.0 setup and deploy your YAML files. So this is using the CLI, I'll be demoing how to deploy the Kubernetes YAML specs. Now, moving on to how to start with the migration of this compose config. So the next step is after I have exported my Docker Compose and Rancher Compose YAML files, what you would do is run this migration tool on top of these files. So what this migration helper tool does is it creates an output.txt file, which is nothing but a list of Docker and Rancher 1.6 constructs per service. So these are the services which were present in my Docker Compose and Rancher Compose files. And per service, it lists everything that cannot be translated automatically into Kubernetes YAML specs, but it has to be translated into equivalent Kubernetes constructs. So the output file will give you an idea what all you need to take care in order to migrate your application. Also, this tool runs Compose tool internally to generate the first level Kubernetes YAML specs. So Compose is a project from Kubernetes which parses the Docker Compose files and generates some Kubernetes YAML specs. Now, as you can see here in the output of my tool, for my services in Rancher 1.6, multiple files, multiple Kubernetes YAML specs have got created. For example, if my web service got translated into a web service YAML file and also a web deployment YAML file. So as we had noted previously, deployment is nothing but a Kubernetes object which is defining all the rules that will deploy the pods of my web service. But this deployment object by itself is not discoverable on the Kubernetes platform. It cannot be accessed. So Kubernetes has another object called as the Kubernetes service. Now this service provides a static endpoint to your deployment objects, and it provides the DNS name for your deployments, and this is the way your clients can connect to your application. Thus, if your 1.6 services are exposing ports, then typically running Compose tool will generate a pair of YAML files. One will be the deployment object, which defines all the deployment rules, and other will be the service file or service YAML, which defines the public access to your workload. With this, I'll then showcase how these YAML files look and what you will have to take care of, how you will have to edit them to bring them into right format. So here I have multiple windows. I'll quickly go through them. One is the Docker Compose YAML file that we have exported, and next is the Rancher Compose YAML file. Here I have the output of the migration tool that we just saw. And in here is the deployment objects that for the web service that the Compose tool had generated. And lastly, the last window is showing how the web deployment object I'll be editing in order to get it ready to be deployed on Rancher 2.1 platform. So I'll be starting with the web service here. These are the concepts that we will have to go through and see how we can migrate them to Kubernetes YAML specs. So firstly, I'll talk about the ports. Now, as you can see in my Docker Compose YAML file, my web service is exposing its private container port 8080 to the public host port 9890. In order to take care of this, there are multiple options in Kubernetes. So we will jump back to the slides and talk about it. So for port mapping, we have two options in Kubernetes. Either you can use host port or you can use node port. If you're using Rancher 2.0 UI, while you are deploying a workload, the UI provides a port mapping section, and in there you can specify whether you want to use a node port or a host port. Now this is very similar to the port mapping section that Rancher 1.6 provided. A little bit about what the host port versus what the node port is, what are the pros and cons of them. So host port is basically opening a port on your Kubernetes node publicly. So if you specify a host port, any external client can reach your pod container using the host IP or the node IP and the host port which is exposed, and the traffic will be routed to your private container port. Now, this functionality is very similar to the port mapping functionality of Rancher 1.6. So pros are any port number that the user specifies can be exposed on the nodes, and the host port setting is directly placed into Kubernetes pod specs. So if you want to figure out how your pod is getting exposed, just looking at the pod specs, host port will tell you that it is exposing itself as using the host port. The cons for using host port is that you can schedule your workload only to the hosts which have the port available, and the scale of your workloads is going to be limited by the number of nodes in the cluster. Again, since you are directly using a host port and a node IP and host port is used by the external client, if your pod gets redeployed, Kubernetes will most likely deploy your pod onto some other node, and the external node IP address of the workload can then change, breaking your external client. So this is the biggest con of using host port, and that's why I think the recommended approach of Kubernetes is using node ports. Node port is nothing but a Kubernetes service type. When you specify a node port is needed for your workload, what you are creating is a service object of type node port, and Kubernetes will basically reserve the node port that you want on each node in your cluster. If you don't specify a node port, a port from already configured node port range gets used up. Now, the pros basically are the node port service is providing a static public endpoint for your application. So even if your pods get reshuffled or redeployed, your external clients are not breaking. And the scale of your workload is not going to be limited by the number of nodes. So looking at this, some of the basics of host port and node port, coming back to the 1.6 application. The application is exposing its port onto public port 9890. I'm going to go ahead and use host port for my migration task. So here, the web deployment YAML specs that Kubernetes Compose tool has created. Under that, under the container spec, you will see that the container port, private port is already listed, but no public port is provided. So what you will have to do is specify the host port in the container spec. So I have edited the deployment file and added my host port 9890 to this YAML spec. Next, we can talk about is the health check. So as you can see, my Rancher Compose YAML file is specifying the Rancher health check that I had applied to my 1.6 service. Now, how you can take care of migrating this to from 1.6 to 2.1. So application health checks in Kubernetes are provided using liveness probe and readiness probe. These probes are nothing but diagnostic tools that are run periodically by the kubelet. In 1.6, the application health checks were done by the Rancher's own health check microservice and typically they run across hosts. In Kubernetes, the probes are run by the kubelet locally running on the node itself. The supported probes or the supported checks are very similar to 1.6. So you can add a TCP check called a TCP socket or HTTP GET to test the HTTP requests, or you can just specify an exec command to be run inside the container. While deploying the application workload, this is how you can specify the application health check. If you're using health checks, here I have illustrated how the config basically looks in Kubernetes YAML. On the left-hand side, you have the Docker Compose YAML, where our health check is always listed in the Rancher Compose file for 1.6 services, because it's a Rancher supported feature. And when you come to 2.1, the health check has to be specified as liveness probe or a readiness probe. You can specify both. You can see that most of the parameters of your 1.6 health check can be mapped to the liveness probe or the readiness probe parameter. For example, you can specify the failure threshold, or you can specify the timeout, or you can specify how many times the probe has to be successful, and so on. So moving on to my migration, what I have done is I have added the liveness probe and readiness probe section to my container spec in order to migrate my health check. This takes care of the ports and the health check, which the Compose tool could not convert. Next thing that we will be talking about is links. Now, as you can see, the Docker Compose file is specifying a Docker link. So what this means is basically we are using an alias named Mongo to refer to the other service in the stack, the database. So this creates a DNS entry called Mongo, and my web service can thus find the database service using the Mongo name. How we can take care of setting up this DNS link in Rancher 2.1. So we will go over a little bit of service discovery concept of Kubernetes. So 2.1 workloads really are discoverable in a very similar way to 1.6 services. All the workloads like deployment, daemon set, job, whichever type of object you are creating, all of them need a Kubernetes service object to make them discoverable. What Rancher does is it auto-creates all these service objects for the workloads that you deploy. So if you're running native Kubernetes, if you create one of these objects won't be discoverable, and you will have to create another service object on top of that to make them discoverable. So Rancher will take care of that internally when you deploy your workload. So as we had talked a little bit on service, it is just a static endpoint for your pods, and each service in Kubernetes gets a DNS name. All services in Kubernetes are discoverable by this DNS format of service name, namespace name, .service.cluster.local. Now this domain name is configurable on your cluster. The service gets discoverable just by service name in your namespace and across namespaces by service name.namespace name. As you can see that this is very similar to your service discovery in Rancher 1.6. Individual pods also get DNS names, just like containers were discoverable in 1.6 setups. Another cool feature of Rancher 2.1 is you can create alias names or DNS links as 1.6 for external host names or external IP address, or also point to other workloads by creating this alias name. Thus, in order to take care of this Docker link in my Docker Compose YAML file, what I'll have to do is create a DNS service record, or basically a Kubernetes service object with the name Mongo. And what it will do is Kubernetes will assign a DNS record with name Mongo and point to the database workload. So in here, I'll show how I have created that Mongo service. So it is nothing but a Kubernetes service YAML spec. The kind service tells Kubernetes that we are creating a service object. The metadata tells what is the name of the service is Mongo, that is the alias name we want to use. And how do we tell that the Mongo is going to point to the database workload? Is using the selector label approach of Rancher 2.0. So what selector label does is this label is placed on the database workload or the database deployment object, and in the service object we select that label and tell Kubernetes that this service object is pointing to the database workload. Thus, using the name Mongo, if you try to discover the service, you are basically hitting the database workload. So this will take care of the link that is present in my web service. Next thing I'm going to talk about is scheduling in Kubernetes. So as you can see, my web service has certain labels. One of the label is io.rancher.container.pullImage. Basically, it is telling Rancher that a new image should always be pulled. In order to take care of this, what you will have to add is image pull policy always in your container spec in your YAML file. The next label is io.rancher.schedulerGlobal, which is telling Rancher to deploy this service as a global service. Now, how you can take care of this? Now, in Kubernetes, global service is nothing but a daemon set object. So this is the web deployment object generated by the Compose tool, but instead of the deployment object, we want a daemon set. So you can just change the kind of your YAML spec to daemon set. Now, a deployment object typically will have replicas, which is nothing but scale of your 1.6 services. Since this is a global service, we don't need to specify any scale for this, as it will be launched on all your nodes. So in my edited deployment specs, I have removed all these constructs like replicas or strategy. So this will turn my deployment object into a daemon set, and Kubernetes will then launch it globally. While we are here, I also want to talk other options of scheduling workloads. So in Rancher 2.0 or using Kubernetes, you can schedule the workloads in a similar fashion as 1.6. You can run all your pods for your workload by specifying a node name, or you can use the hard or soft node level affinity, anti-affinity rules. This is very similar to Rancher 1.6. So if you are using the affinity rules, this is how your specs will look as compared to Docker Compose. In the Docker Compose, we were just using the Rancher specific labels to specify scheduling rules. So this particular label is basically a host level hard affinity rule. This translates to an affinity section in your Kubernetes deployment specs. So under affinity, for host level affinity, you can specify the construct node affinity. And the next, required during scheduling, ignored during execution, just tells Kubernetes that this is a hard affinity rule. If you're going to use a soft affinity rule, instead of required, the term is preferred during scheduling, ignored during execution. Now, here you are just specifying that you want to deploy this workload only on a node which has a label foo equal to bar. So the Rancher scheduling label gets translated to the affinity or the node affinity construct in your Kubernetes YAML file. Thus, in order to schedule my global service, I use daemon set, and my database service was using a host label soft affinity rule. I'll be using the node affinity section in my database deployment YAML. Moving on, this took care of most of my constructs of a web service that the output file mentions that I need to take care. So the last thing that I would like to talk about is the load balancing. So I had a web LB service in my Rancher 1.6 stack, which was running the Rancher's own HA proxy container. And it is using basically the hostname and port-based routing, and that LB config is present in the Rancher Compose YAML file. Now, for load balancing, the Kubernetes options are for HTTP and HTTPS balancing, you would have to create Kubernetes ingress specs. So ingress is nothing but a specification of your load balancer config. And in your Kubernetes cluster, when there is an ingress controller running, when you create an ingress, this ingress controller is going to get invoked and configure the load balancer present in your cluster with the rules. So if Rancher 2.1, we have the nginx ingress controller deployed internally. This is available globally. It is not a scalable service as Rancher 1.6. So the nginx ingress controller will listen to all ingress creations, and it will configure the nginx load balancer in your Kubernetes cluster. This also supports hostname and path-based routing. The only caveat here is that you have to use unique hostname and path-based routing rules. This is because the nginx ingress controllers is launched globally. So the same node IPs are being used to forward traffic for all workloads, and ingress, Kubernetes ingress only listens on, applies to port 80 and 443. Because of this common access points, you have to use unique hostname and path rules for creating load balancing rules for your workloads. For TCP support with Rancher 2.1, you can configure a layer 4 load balancer in the cloud provider in which your Kubernetes cluster is running. So you have to choose a layer 4 load balancer option while you are mapping your ports. And what this will do is Rancher will create a layer 4 load balancer Kubernetes service object. And this in turn will configure the load balancer appliance running on your cluster. So this depends on having a load balancer appliance in your Kubernetes cluster. In order to migrate my load balancer config rules, what I have done is created an ingress spec because I'm using HTTP hostname path-based routing rule. The ingress spec that I have created is this. It looks like this. So you have to specify the kind as ingress. And just as 1.6, you can specify your host name for your routing rule, which is the myapp.chat.com in my Rancher Compose. And the path is /login. You can specify that in your ingress spec. In my Rancher Compose, this host name and path was targeting my service web on the port 8080. Similarly, in my ingress spec, you can specify the backend. The service name is web. This is the Kubernetes service object that will create along with the web deployment object. And the target port is going to be 8080. As you can see that the load balancer config is very similar to the one in Rancher Compose file. So this takes care of all my services in my application. The last service that was the database service, it was using the soft level affinity rule that we talked about. The scale gets converted to replicas. With this, what I will show is how you can deploy them to a Rancher 2.1 setup. I want to quickly note here before moving on is the Compose tool also generates a lot of annotations that are not really necessary. So you can just remove them from your Kubernetes YAML specs. And one more thing is in your Kubernetes YAML specs under the metadata section, you can specify the namespace to which you want to deploy your application. So if you're using the CLI or using the UI to import this YAML, the correct namespace gets used for deploying your workloads. Now, moving on to how you can deploy these workloads, I have downloaded the Rancher CLI tool, and after downloading that, you can use the Rancher login command to configure that CLI tool against your Rancher setup. What the login command takes is a token. Now, this is nothing but the API key secret key that you have to create on Rancher UI and provide it to the Rancher CLI. And if you are using certificates, provide the CA-cert, and then the URL or the name of the server against which the tool should run. Once configured, you can then run this tool against your Rancher setup, which will list all the workloads running on your Rancher. So currently my setup has the namespace default and my app, and two of my deployments are already running. I can then use the tool to deploy the Kubernetes YAML specs that we had just created. First, I'll start with deploying the database service. I will also create the Mongo service object, which we had created just to take care of the Docker link present in my web service. Then the next, I'll deploy my web service edited YAML file. I'll also deploy the service object for my web service, which will take care of the DNS entry for my service. And lastly, we will deploy the load balancing ingress spec. This will create an ingress rule fronting my web application. So if you can list back, I can see that my web service has deployed as a daemon set, which is a global service, and database has already deployed as a deployment and running the Mongo image. I'll quickly show my Rancher 2.0 setup. You can see that the workloads that we just deployed get listed by namespace by default under my workloads tab. So here I have the database service, and we have the web service, which is running as a global service. I had 3 nodes, so one per node is launched, and it is also exposing the host port, which can be used to access my Let's Chat application. Then I had also created the ingress rule. So under the load balancing tab, you can see that the WebLB ingress got created with the host name and path-based routing rule. And we can see if we can reach our web service using this ingress rule. So to do that, I'll just describe my ingress spec. So you can use the Rancher CLI and run any kubectl, native kubectl commands. I have to specify the namespace in which the ingress got created. So this is the ingress with the hostname routing rule and the path-based routing rule. And it lists all the ingress addresses that you can use to reach your service. So we can try to reach this service by the simple curl command. My host that I had specified is myapp.chat.com. This is my ingress address, one of the addresses, and we'll try to reach it on the path login. Yeah. So the ingress has configured the nginx load balancer, and it is able to route the traffic to my chat service. Here you can see that it loaded the home page of my chat application that we were able to reach using the host port as well. Thus, my 1.6 application has gotten transformed to the 2.1 setup using the Kubernetes YAML specs and the Rancher CLI. With this, I'll move on to jot down some migration artifacts that you can use to move your workloads using this method. So we have the documentation on our Rancher site. We have all the blogs which are talking in detail about all these things like port mapping, scheduling, load balancing, etc. under the tag cattle to KTS. Then we also have a migration walkthrough video that you can take a look at, and the migration tool that we had just used. to parse or compose config files and list the constructs that that you will have to take care in order to launch your Kubernetes YAML spec. And if you have any other questions, or we have not covered any area that you would like to migrate to Rancher 2.0, you can always ask questions on a Rancher user Slack channel that we have created recently, V16-V21-migration, and our engineers will be present on the channel to answer the questions. So
Awesome.
with that, Shannon, I have done the walkthrough of the migration, and you can take over.
Okay, wow, Prachi, that was great. I know we're about an hour and 20 minutes into the discussion. We've covered a lot. There have been hundreds of questions, so I appreciate everyone asking the questions. I know Will, Adrian, and I have been doing our best to answer lots of these. There are still a handful that may be worth talking about out loud. So, Will, are you still there in the room with Prachi?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Great. Maybe we can just talk through a couple of the ones that have been coming up. And I noticed it felt like there was a ton of questions about load balancing and DNS. Maybe we can kind of dive into that topic for just a minute. Do you want to? I mean, I think Robert asked, how does level 4 load balancer work with bare metal only setup? And I saw a number of questions about sort of load balancing as a setup. Do you want to maybe just kind of address that?
Yeah, I was actually answering that specific question too. So the way Kubernetes work, and I'm not, it could be a little bit up to, I'm not the engineer, but Ingress is really at the layer 7 level, so it only supports 18.4.3. I think I saw a question related to that. Then Kubernetes also has a load balancer concept, which is the layer 4. Now, Kubernetes itself has a framework that allows cloud providers to integrate with it, such as AWS or Google. So, for example, on AWS, they would have implemented a layer 4 load balancer, which should map to ELB. And so you get that for free. If you happen to deploy something on AWS and select AWS as a cloud provider, they would have implemented a layer 4 load balancer, and they would hook up directly with ELB, for example. However, you have questions about bare metal. Obviously, they don't have, there's no cloud provider for bare metal. And again, I'm not an expert on this, but there should be a way for vendors. So, for example, if you want, I'm sure that there might be an HA proxy version. There may be one from F5 for the various load balancer companies that may have implemented a driver specific for Kubernetes. Again, I'm not an expert on that, but I would assume there should be a way to do this today. That being said, we are looking in 2.2. We are looking to add a new feature that would allow us to deploy both an external DNS, or actually a global DNS or a global load balancer that can not only span, basically it's going to allow you to span workloads across cluster. And this is something we're trying to look into adding for 2.2 right now. And so that could be another option once 2.2 ships. But this is something that is going to be implemented with a Rancher specific kind of our own CRD, our own project that's going to solve this particular problem. So that's something that is potential that we can use in 2.2. It's not in 2.1 right now. 2.1, in order to get layer 4 to work, you're going to have to work with what Kubernetes has today for that. And I think for bare metal, there should be a way, and I'm not an expert on this, should be a way to do it. I just know that the cloud providers themselves have already implemented a way to do so automatically. But for bare metal, I'm not sure at the top of my head how easily this can be done. Maybe someone with actual better Kubernetes experience. Do you know actually for layer 4 load balancer? You have to implement yourself, or you have to implement a cloud provider? That I'm not sure. Yeah, we have a different engineer that would actually know, but she's not here, so I can't ask her right now.
I just wanted to add that the 84.4 HTTP is basically Kubernetes ingress limitation. So NGINX ingress controller itself can support TCP and UDP on any port, but because we are specifying the LB config from ingress, then the limitation comes because of that.
There was another question?
Yeah, lots more. So one question was, can I run Rancher 2 on Raspberry Pis? Robert asked. Robert, that's actually something we're working on, but we haven't rolled out yet. So Kubernetes works on Raspberry Pis. You can use Kubernetes directly on it, but we haven't done kind of some testing and such that we'd like to sort of provide a supported thing there. But keep your eyes on kind of the news feed over the next sort of 2 months, 2 to 3 months, kind of around the end of the year, and hopefully we'll be making some announcements to kind of give you the sign off on Raspberry Pis. Okay, there was another question about which Docker release is supported for 2.1. Do you want to just kind of respond to that again, Will?
It's 17. So upstream, it's going to be 1703 is going to be the minimum. So we're not going to support 113, 112 anymore with 2.1. It should be updated in our branch website as well. But 1703 upstream is going to be what we support. I think if you're using a RHEL, we support the RHEL Docker on 7.5. So whatever that is, we'll test against that and verify against that. I don't think they're on 17. I think they're on 113, if I remember correctly.
Awesome. There's a question early on that Ilya asked. He said, maybe it's a bit early for this question, but is there support for CIFS volumes in Rancher 2.1, or is it still needed to mount the shares directly on the host? Do you know the answer to that?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. We're going to have to ask one of the storage guys. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
All right, Ilya, just ping me on Slack if you're on Slack, on the slack.rancher.io. And I'll put you in touch with Shen. There's actually our meetup last month covered this exact topic. So if you want to sort of get all the Kubernetes storage knowledge you could ever possibly need and look at a bunch of different options, you might want to take a look at that. It's also in that meetup channel that I mentioned before, the YouTube channel for Rancher. You can find it there, but just Google it as well. You can find just Rancher Storage Online Meetup, and you'll probably find it pretty easily there. Thanks for that. There's a really good question that I think it's Amey, A-M-E-Y, I hope I'm not spelling that wrong, asked, and he said, do we have any documentation link for recommendations for a Rancher 2.1 production grade deployment? So, best practices guide, sort of how to get this up and running. Will, I know we do have a couple different things that can help with that, but anything jump to mind for you that you would want to point people to?
No, I mean, there's really two things, right? Number one is a production grade Rancher server. That definitely is in our documentation guide that teaches you how to deploy an HA mode. That's already there in our 2.0 docs. Now, I don't know there's a best practice specific guide on the actual managed Kubernetes cluster itself, especially if you build one through Rancher. But on the top of my head, what most people do is 3 nodes for etcd for quorum and 2 for HA on the control plane. The number of worker nodes is up to you however you need. That's usually our recommendation. And then if you want specifics to kind of like the memory requirements for these things, for etcd, I think it's a pretty standard one. For the control plane, it's really going to be based on the number of workloads because that's how Kubernetes works today. It actually keeps almost everything in memory, and so the number of hosts, number of workloads that grows, you're going to have to increase the size of the nodes that you are putting your control plane stuff specific to the API manager. That thing will grow, and so we have a size for that. I'm not sure if it's out yet. I know we've developed it, but we can look into it. Bill from my team has already developed a sizing guide for that. So if it's not there somewhere, it should be there fairly soon.
Awesome. Lori asked a question. She said, there's some kind of similar ones. Lori said, I use external DNS service with AWS Route 53. Yep. Will that still work, or is there a replacement service? And then Alessandro said, would something like DigitalOcean DNS be available on Rancher 2.1? Anything you can talk about with sort of Route 53 DNS?
So right now for 2.1, there is no equivalent of an external kind of a DNS solution for 1.6, but it is actually something we're working on 2.2. So the whole 2.2 concept is exactly what you're talking about, something the integration. In fact, Route 53 is our first integration specific to that, but we are planning to create some framework so you can add other DNS providers, Cloudflare, I guess DigitalOcean DNS. I'm not familiar with that myself. But that is, for 2.2, we do plan on adding the whole concept of this external kind of global layer 4 load balancer and DNS to be able to automate. So the idea of that is kind of like 1.6, right? If you maybe through labels or however we connect to that, if things change in the cluster, pod change, IP change, whatever, we'll automatically update those providers for you. So that is actually coming in 2.2.
Got it. Now, there were 2 things I noticed, Will. Mark and Christian said the same thing, that they can't build migration dash tools. Do you have binaries somewhere that people can download? So migration tools is not building. They're getting an error from the Google APIs. Mark is. So anything you can add to that, or do you know where, you know what's going on that may be causing that issue?
Yeah, the migration tool is available on the GitHub, and there are a couple of releases already from which you can download the binary. If you have some problems with the download, just probably.
I think they were trying to build it themselves and couldn't build it.
Oh, okay. So.
I mean, our recommendation is just to download the build that we've created rather than building it yourself. I don't know specifically why it doesn't build, but we certainly have the tool.
Where can they download that?
It is on our GitHub Rancher repo.
Which one?
With the
what
repo called as Migration-Tools.
Migration-Tools. Okay, there you go. There should be a release, right? Under releases.
Under
releases.
Under releases, you can download the binaries that we have generated.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'll post this up so everyone can find it. If you can't find it, I'm going to give you Prachi's email address, so feel free to email her.
And Shannon, while you're doing that, there's a lot of questions about Helm chart and catalog, so I can answer that. Hopefully, that can
please.
A bunch of interesting as well. So the way So for 2.1, from a catalog perspective, we only support Helm right now. I mean, there's some obvious advantage of using Helm. It supports variable interpolation, does upgrades, does versioning. So we didn't want to re-implement all that construct that we had already supported 1.6 and 2.0, so we decided to use Helm instead. So there is no catalog for raw Kubernetes YAML file. You have to actually convert it to Helm charts, so we can leverage that. And then there was a lot of questions that said, can we just use native Helm or simple Helm? The answer is yes. I mean, if you look at 2.2's catalog, 2.1's catalog system, you can always, it actually has, the default, it actually uses the Rancher catalog repo, but you can always turn on the official Helm stable or Helm incubator repos as well. You can use it. The only difference in the Helm the only difference in the Rancher catalog version that we have by default is the fact that I've actually tested those, or my team has tested those catalogs. So while we can't provide any SLA in the actual, for example, if WordPress is there, if WordPress breaks, there's nothing I can do about that. But I can at least ensure you the Helm chart will deploy through Rancher, because a lot of the Helm charts today, even in the stable, it's very difficult. I think the most difficult part is the fact that a lot of them require persistent storage in order to do that. And so unless you have some type of persistent volumes already enabled, it probably will fail the moment you try to deploy it. And so in the Rancher catalog version, we've done a couple of things. Number one, we've also added the whole idea of you adding questions. This is very similar to 1.6, so that it'll make, at least from a user experience standpoint, a lot easier to deploy, because you have to understand from Helm today, it's all driven from CLI. So if you read the Helm, kind of like the Helm README file or Helm description, how to launch it, it really is deployed through the Helm CLI method. So it doesn't make sense. When you look at the catalog, it doesn't make sense. So number one, we've added the ability to add your own custom questions and answers, and then make default values, so it's a lot easier for users to use it. And so if you look at a lot of the Rancher catalog, a lot of the Helm charts in the Rancher catalog, you literally can just click go and it'll just go, because we've vetted out some reasonable defaults for you to use, so you can get it up and running. And then in the questions ammo, it's got a simple logic for you to do if and else logic, so that certain questions don't even have to be asked if it doesn't even make sense, rather than the normal Helm chart, which essentially says here are all the key value pairs you can put into it and just have at it. And so the questions, a file that we allow you to add, and you don't modify anything, you simply add that into the repo itself or into the directory, and it just gives you a smarter way for you to guide the user to deploying those Helm charts. That's all. We don't make any modifications to Helm directly, and so those are just optional things. You don't have to use it, but in our experience, it's just nicer to have the option to do so. So that's kind of the differences between the two. And again, from a CLI standpoint, you should be able to deploy all these directly through a CLI as well. If it's not there, we'll eventually add it. I don't know why it wouldn't be there, but if it's not there, we certainly would add it in the near future. There's no reason why we wouldn't support that. So hopefully that answers all the Helm chart questions that I saw.
Okay, and sorry everyone for the echo. I got some new speakers on my desk, and I think they're a little too powerful for my mic, so I'll have to go back to my old setup. But I will be muting myself. Okay, a couple more questions. I thought one was from Alexter, asked almost an hour ago. So Alexter, I'm sorry it took so long, but you said, when using email upon health check issues, can we create different groups based on the type of issue? I don't actually know the answer to that. I was wondering if, Will, you knew whether the alerts based on emails could be sort of filtered by, kind of a critical a critical alert going to a specific group. Do you know the answer to that, or we're going to have to look it up and maybe answer it somewhere else?
Are you talking about the 2.0 alert feature?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Can we create different groups based on the type of issues?
Like
yes,
all critical emails go to one thing.
Yeah,
I think
you can.
A different notifier, right?
Yeah, so yes, you would assign. So in 2.1, you would create different notifiers, so to speak. And a notifier is like email or Slack, anything like that. So for in this case, you probably would create two different notifiers from email to do different email aliases. And then when you create the alert rules, you can assign it appropriately to which email alias you would want to forward the alerts to.
There was someone who asked, Stefan said that will the questions be provided on GitHub, all these questions and answers that have been going on? Yes. To that end, we also, I don't know if you guys all saw, but while we were speaking, I threw up a new Meetup channel called Online Meetup in our Rancher Slack, where you can also kind of dial over there and ask questions, just hashtag, at Will for Will or at Prachi for Prachi or at Shannon, and we'll see it and we'll kind of come back in there. So feel free to keep the conversation going afterwards and tag us on anything if you need a request. Otherwise, there's a lot of other people in there who are also answering and asking questions. We will be sharing, though, any questions that go out on GitHub, and you'll see the answers kind of from there. Stefan, thanks for asking about that. Okay, there's, I think, a really good question that Eugene said, which is, he said, look, we talked a lot about migrating a Rancher catalog item to a Helm chart, and then using that approach effectively to migrate from 1.6 to 2.1. We have about 25 catalog, which we use to deploy. Half of them are also out there in an open source project. So I'd really like to figure out, how to do this properly. Not only how to migrate the catalog, but also how to migrate the stacks and everything. I mean, that's, Eugene, that's what we've been trying to talk about all day today, is to kind of cover that concept. And so, all of the blogs and docs and tooling are all about how to effectively take a Rancher Compose YAML, which is kind of the basis of a catalog item for 1.6, and transform it into a Kubernetes YAML file or a Helm chart. I think we focus.
Shannon.
Yeah.
I think that the question is actually to Helm directly. So today's meetup is about transforming Compose to Kubernetes YAML file. But I think that what he's really asking is, can I go from Compose to Helm directly? And the answer to that is, we don't have. It's not in this meetup, because to translate from Kubernetes YAML to Helm, there should already be a system out there today, right? This is like taking any normal Kubernetes YAML file, following the directions that Helm provides to say, this is how you convert a YAML file to a Kubernetes Helm chart. I don't know if there's a tool. I haven't done that myself. Is there a tool to do that, or is there a set of instructions that you would do to do that? I'm not sure myself, but that already exists. So what we're trying to do is help people convert from Compose into YAML file, and there should already be blogs or documentation that would convert a Kubernetes YAML file to a Helm chart.
Eugene, though, if you're kind of struggling with those type of things, you need some additional help on it.
Right.
That's a great call to, a great reason to send an email over. We'll definitely be happy to take a look at the issue and help you, with kind of finding the right tooling to help you migrate all those applications. Okay, Royer asked a question that I thought was a good one. He said, when you guys were talking about networking differences between 1.6 and 2.0, you mentioned that both support Flannel and Canal in 2.0. That said, I do know that Calico is also supported. Is there a reason why it wasn't mentioned? Is that because Flannel or Canal work better with Rancher versus Calico? Someone had asked earlier, what about Weave? So maybe, Will, you can just talk about sort of kind of the difference between networking support options in 1.6 and 2.1, and sort of CNI in general, maybe. And we will, just to mention too, we also, I posted this to one of the questions, but I did, in case you didn't see it, we also did a whole meetup about networking in Kubernetes, like a master class that went for 2.5 hours, that I recommend everybody that does this move kind of go and watch. It's fantastic. And it's on our channel that I've been talking about. So youtube.com/c/rancher. But do you want to talk about Flannel, Canal, and then Calico?
No problem. So 1.6, like I said earlier in my slides, Rancher had implemented our own versions of network drivers, so to speak. It was loosely based off CNI as well, but we had supported kind of an IPsec implementation, which is really the default that you get from 1.6 to VXLAN, and then we have this host subnet as well. It's not really as popular, but it was there as well. In 2.0, of course, we're leveraging the ecosystem of Kubernetes. So Flannel is a very simple, I think the simple layer 3, host-based networking as well. That is that and Canal default. Canal is really just Flannel with the Calico network policy implemented on top of it. The reason why we chose to have Canal as our default when you install RKE cluster or a cluster that you use Rancher to help create is because it provides a network policy. Now, by default, and there was a few questions before about project communications and network policies, by default, we actually turn it off. And the reason why we do that is because even though the network policy is enabled, we don't actually leverage it if you just install Rancher, because it was confusing people of pods not communicating with each other. However, if you do turn it on, what happens is that inter-project communication through the network policy would be denied. And so between projects, pods won't be able to access each other. Even though DNS entries may be created, you won't be able to hit another pod from a different project if it's on. And that's something you have to turn on explicitly when you create a cluster through Rancher. And then you talk about Calico and Weave. So Calico is also an option there. Now, we do support the fact that Calico gets deployed. What we don't support is the actual Calico implementation itself. So if Calico has an issue with that, the reason why it's not as prominent there is because you would have to have a separate SLA, or assuming you want support for Calico itself with Tigera, for example, you would have to get support for them because we won't be able to address any Calico specific problems. I think part of it they have, if I'm not mistaken, they have some closed source aspect of the Calico driver itself. But anyways, from an SLA standpoint, you're welcome to deploy it through us. I think that's the open source version. But from a support SLA on the implementation Calico itself, you would have to get that through Tigera, for example. Weave is also another option for two, actually maybe even earlier. We'll make that available as well. Again, Weave is going to be very similar to Calico. You're going to have to get support from Weave directly if you want that. But we'll make it available through the GUI so that you could select it when creating the cluster. Now, nothing prevents you from doing that today. If you go through a GUI today, you won't have all the nice drop-down options you see in the GUI, but we do have an option there that you could deploy Weave itself. It's kind of an advanced option where you see the YAML file, the configuration file that you would do if you were to deploy raw Kubernetes yourself. So it's there. We may not have all the options in the nice GUI format. But so while Weave is there not today, nothing prevents you from installing or launching a Kubernetes cluster with Weave enabled. It just takes a little bit more work.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers those questions for network questions.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions. Is it possible to use Rancher CLI to deploy apps from the Rancher catalog for automating app deployments with CLI, the IAC way?
So I did ask that, and if it's not there, it's something we should add. I mean, there's no reason that we wouldn't have you, it's an API that we call. So if it's not there today, the answer is, if it's not there, we would certainly add it. I just don't know at the top of my head whether the CLI has everything has the full 100% support of the API today. I know we were working on that for 2.1, but I'm not 100% sure if that particular feature is there. But it should be. If it's not there, we're going to certainly add it.
Awesome. Okay, we're down to the last couple of these. One was, is it possible to reach Helm directly from within Rancher or from within the CLI, Will? I'm not sure I totally
Well, the
got the
CLI
question.
question I just answered, but if you, yeah, I mean, you can always use Helm. I assume Helm is a CLI, so you can use Helm CLI to deploy to Rancher. There shouldn't be an issue. And I think Rancher itself has Helm already. We're to launch Tiller itself, so you can probably connect directly there using the Helm CLI. I don't think there's an issue with that.
Got it. There was another question from Tyler, which isn't really about migration, but it's a good question about 2.2 or 2.1. And Tyler said, does Rancher 2.1 add any more features for imported clusters? Currently, imported clusters are limited in what can be done in the GUI, and that seems strange if the cluster was stood up with RKE. So Tyler, yeah, this is a really good question. So if you're building the cluster with RKE, you don't really want to use the import cluster mechanism because it means that the Rancher management server doesn't sort of stand up the cluster itself. You want to use the custom version, which allows you to deploy the cluster where Rancher kind of auto registers it in and sort of assumes that it has management. If it's deployed with RKE and then imported, we don't really know the difference between it and something that wasn't deployed with RKE. It's a good suggestion. Maybe we should be able to discover that and then sort of, if it is an RKE thing, take more ownership of it than we do today. But I don't know, Will, do you want to add anything to that question?
Yeah, I mean, if you import any cluster today, which is something we support, all of the Rancher value adds will work the same. The only thing you lose from an imported cluster standpoint is the management of the cluster itself, simply because we just don't know how to add nodes to it. For example, if you had let's say you create an OpenShift cluster and import that in, I wouldn't know. Rancher just doesn't know how to add additional nodes to it. You have to do it outside of Rancher. Whereas if you built it through Rancher itself, especially if you created something through our machine drivers, we would know how to do it, right? Even in our EKS or our cloud hosted providers, since we have API access to it, we can certainly implement ways of adding or deleting nodes from those clusters itself through Rancher because we have access to the API itself. These imported cluster, what we're doing is we're just communicating with that cluster via the Kubernetes API. So whatever we can do through there, we can certainly do through Rancher. But all the alerting, monitoring, any of the cross load balancer feature that but the global load balancer DNS features that I mentioned earlier, the centralized authentication, RBAC, all those things are consistent across any cluster that has been created or imported into Rancher. There should be no difference there. The only difference you're going to see is the management of the cluster itself. So even in 2.2, when we add the whole Prometheus monitoring, you're going to have full access to it. We don't even know at that point in time if it is imported or not, to be honest. It should all work the same.
Awesome. Okay, last question was from Soel. He said, we have Terraform stack for different BPMN applications deployed via Rancher on one EC2 instance, each created via Terraform on AWS. This is all done via Bamboo job without any manual setup, and also each AC2 instance IP then gets registered on Route 53. Do we need to do something differently with 2.0? I'm not sure. Do we need to create different clusters for each application deployment here? Or do they, maybe they need to wait until Terraform gets support for Rancher 2.x? Anything you want to add to this? I mean, I think this isn't that uncommon of a deployment model.
Yeah, I'm still trying to understand this question itself. This is all done.
I mean, if Terraform is what's standing up the Rancher stack, you can still use Terraform with Rancher 2 because you can just use the custom API calls. Once Terraform creates the hosts, it should stand it up. Now, your integration with Route 53, that might be something you need to take a look at.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, I think we in 2.2 we are working on a specific integration with an external DNS like Route 53, so that's there. I'm just not sure, if I'm going to do justice by answering it because I'm not really sure the context. So perhaps something you could put in the Slack channel, what we're going to do, and we can get someone like Bill or someone that knows this a bit more than I do. Maybe they can provide comments there.
Awesome. All right, with that, I think we should wrap up. There are a couple quick things. So we talked about Helm quite a bit. Helm is actually going to be the topic of our next meetup when we talk about building, private Helm repos, building public Helm repos, sharing those things, understanding the difference between the community catalog, the Rancher certified catalog. So we're going to dive deep into cataloging. We did something similar maybe a year and a half ago on cattle, and we'll be doing that for our November meetup just before, probably the third week of November. So keep an eye out for that. And then in December, we're going to be talking about cross-application clustering or Prometheus. I think we're still kind of one or two of those will be sort of the main topics as we go into the December timeframe. But with that, I'd love to have other suggestions. So if you have ideas of things you would like to cover, if you're interested in speaking at one of these meetups, we'd love to have more guest speakers. Please just use the questions or use that online meetup. If you want to share a case study, you want to tell what you're doing, we're more than well open to additional people joining the meetup and presenting. But with that, I just wanted to kind of leave you with a few things. There were some questions about how to get started and doing production deployments. All the docs are available here. The Quick Start Guide has a bunch of information. It's gotten dramatically more robust since 2.0 was first released. You can find a lot in there about more and more sort of high scale out deployments. You can also find docs, and information on GitHub under some of the sub projects, things like Rancher OS, RKE. I think there's one that's a container engine, which is a new one that allows you to spin up clusters. So there's a lot of different open source projects that that you can all find under Rancher/Rancher and get going there. And with that, I really just want to thank everyone for coming and bearing with us through the technical difficulties we had to start the meetup. Prachi, thank you for not just presenting on this, but also all of the documentation, all of the resources, all of the videos and blog posts and everything you've done over the last kind of 2 months. If you have questions about migration that haven't been answered, Prachi is on Slack. She is happy to answer. She's on Twitter. You can find her there. You can also find Will and I very easily. Don't get frustrated if something kind of feels like it's not working as you expected. Just ask for help. We're all here. There's 15,000 deployments of Rancher 1.6 as of this morning that are out there sending us stats. So I know there's a lot of people who are still dealing with this. And if you need help, don't stress. Like the other thing is, we're not going anywhere quickly. This is, we're not talking until end of next year before anything really changes and before we start to kind of move to end of life of 1.6. So you've got time. If you need something that's not in 2.1, maybe 2.2 will cover the feature you need, especially some of the stuff around Route 53 or maybe different networking models or multi-cluster deployments, network encryption. There's lots of different things that are, pretty great and distinct about 1.6 that make it difficult. There's also some work going on some new stuff that I think we'll be announcing in the spring to hopefully make it a little bit easier for people to potentially run really small clusters, 2-node clusters we talked about today. There's some stuff we could do certainly to take off some of the load of running those management servers. I'd also recommend looking at some of the hosted services like, EKS and GKE. They will also make it easy to run a Kubernetes cluster without needing a lot of management. But with all that, I will thank you all for attending. If you have further questions, feel free. I'll stay on here for a few minutes. But it's even easier if you join the new Slack channel we created in the middle of the meetup this time. So just sit over there and fire us off a question if you have anything. Last one, if you have topics that you think we should be covering that we're not, please also either throw those to me in a question or suggest them on the Slack channel. We're also hiring a ton. I should have mentioned that earlier on. Will and I both have, between the two of us, a dozen open recs right now as we're kind of Rancher's been growing really fast this year. So if you love this stuff so much that you want to work on it full time, we don't really care where you're located. So, we're hiring people in every continent, everywhere in the world. So send us your resume. You can find all that on Jobs, or even better, hit us up on Slack. It always is impressive when we get resumes that way. With that, I will. I'll say have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you again next month. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Prachi.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you, everyone.